So this is module 5 from DBXL Training. The purpose of this module is similar to the previous module where we query data from Active Directory. The goal is, hey, let's make the form easier for the user to fill out, right? So we added in the previous module data connections to Active Directory. Those data connections are bringing in information, my name, my email, my manager's name, my manager's email. So we just reduced the number of fields that the user needs to type into, right? So these 4 fields, the user doesn't have to worry about. It's automatic, right? So our purpose in this next lab is to do the same thing. And to do that, we're going to switch to QueryDB. It's a web service contained in DBXL. And let me just go to our training site, so I can show you the list of web services. These are all the web services that are included in DBXL. And here is QueryDB. Here's Active Directory that we just covered in the previous lab. Here's QueryDB. And this is Query SharePoint. So QueryDB and Query SharePoint have similar philosophies as well. One queries from a SQL database and the other queries from a SharePoint list. So similar ideas. This lab will focus on QueryDB, but we have documentation for Query SharePoint available on our website if you are interested in that. So the requirement, the prerequisite here is that there's some data that we want to query. And I think that is already added here. Let me just check. Yeah, here's a table. So this table has a department column, a position column, and this is pretty simple data. I realize that, but I think the philosophy behind it is still valid. The idea is we have a department field in the form, so why don't we provide these options to the user, right? And let's even get more specific. If we're going to provide a department for the user, let's also ask them the position. I mean, it's there in SQL, so why not make use of it in the form? It just makes sense that we have the data available within our network, so why not make use of it? So the form is going to need some visual changes to make this a little bit more appealing. As you can see here, the department and the title are on different rows, so it's a little bit odd to read. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move these around just to make this a bit easier. I'm actually going to put the email address right next to the name just so that it matches here. The manager has name and email address. So we're just making things a little cleaner here on our canvas. And now we have our department and our title right next to each other. And those two fields are going to get populated with the data from here, department and position. So instead of title, it's called position, but that's just a technicality. It's the same idea. Now, in order to use QueryDB, there's a prerequisite, and that is that we need to give permission to DBXL to query this table. Out of the box, DBXL doesn't have permission to interact with any databases other than QueryDB, other than the QueryDBXL, Qdabra DBXL, and Qdabra utility databases that DBXL installs and needs to function correctly. Outside of that, permissions need to be granted. So you as the DBXL administrator have control over that. and I'm going to show you this. It's not possible for you to perform these steps along with me on our server, but I just want to show you the change that is required on the server to allow DBXL, to authorize DBXL to communicate with those tables. And if you don't do this, you're going to get an error back. So it's not that SQL is going to be blocking the connection. It's actually DBXL blocking the connection. DBXL is saying, nope, I don't have permission to communicate with that table. Or with that database, I'm sorry. So let me go to the in the inet pub www root wss virtual directories 80 Qdabra web service, and back to our web config, which we talked about in a previous training module. There's a section in here called enumDB, which is what I want to find. And here's the section. And here's the section that here are the specifics. Servers is a section that grants DBXL permission to communicate with a specific SQL server. So this line right here allows DBXL to connect with QSHP 2010 SQL Express. And this line right here allows DBXL to communicate with SQL-prod-01 development. And it has some examples here, some commented out examples of how you can add more lines. So you can have DBXL communicate with as many, with more SQL instances than just one. But you need to add that line here. So you need to have a line such as this one. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's just DBXL is going to reject the connection. So it's really giving you, as the DBXL administrator, the power to reject those connections. And then there's, after the server section, there's a databases section. So this gets more specific. So this is saying within the server default. So what is our server default? It's right here, server name default. I'm going to allow DBXL to communicate with the database called DBXL Training. And let's say that you don't want the users to know that there's a database called DBXL Training. Well, then you can provide it an alias. And let's just call it, let's just call it training, right? So that means that you, as the DBXL administrator, you are creating this database alias. So when you go to your, let's say you have a couple of form designers in your team, you're going to tell them, hey, the database alias that you're communicating with is called training. And that's all they need to know. They're just communicating with the alias called training. They don't need to know the DBXL name. They don't need to know the data connection. They don't need to know anything else. Just tell them this. Alias equals training. So let me save that. And let's go back to our InfoPath form so we can start adding our data connections. Now, we could, after a certain level of experience, we could come here and add this in the same way that we add any other Qdabra Web Service data connection, like that, right? Query DB. And it's going to provide us a list of operations, and it's going to allow us to choose amongst those operations. So we have these operations, and And typically what you're going to see is that the operation that we most use in our training and in our documentation is this one. There are uses for the other ones, but this is used in 95% of the cases. And you're going to get to this screen, and you're going to say, okay, what is query XML? I don't know what that is. Query XML, don't worry, you don't have to type this out. You don't have to magically figure out what this is. We provide a tool that allows you to build this in a really simple way. And that tool is Query Builder. I'm pretty sure I have it installed already, so let me just check here. Yeah, here it is. So this is Qdabra's Query Builder. So the idea here is that we provide a visual interface that allows you to create the query that you need for your form. So you simply enter your web service URL. We know that the web service is Qdabra web service, and we know that we want to obtain data from a SQL database. And we give you two options here: specify a database name or alias, or specify a database connection string. So we just defined an alias. So let's just use that alias. The alias was training. And you see there's a checkbox here that says is alias, right? So once we do that, we don't have anything in the table name dropdown. We can refresh the database schema, and it's going to say that database alias training was not found in web config. Didn't I just add that? Well, it was called something else before. Let me not change it because somebody else could be using it. So this is actually DBXL Training. Yeah, there it is. So maybe it's getting... maybe there's something going on there. But anyway, so there's the alias. The one thing to notice is that the alias gets placed around pound signs or hashtags, I guess so they're called. If I uncheck is alias, so if I'm an administrator and I just know what the database name is, those disappear. So the is alias checkbox is really more for end users, that, you know, form designers that don't necessarily know the database name, they just know the alias. So I can come here and I can select the table, and here it is, QueryDB source data. And there are some options here such as max row count. If you have a lot of data, you can specify a maximum number of rows that get returned. If you have repeated data, you know, you can check the distinct checkbox to make sure that you only get distinct options. I am actually going to check that because I know that I have support, sales, support again, sales again, administration, administration, administration. So I have a lot of repetition here. So I am going to check distinct just to have DBXL itself clean up that repeated data. And then in the query columns section, I'm going to get a drop down with the list of columns that are available. And right now, all I want to do is query the department. So I'm only going to select that, and that's all I'm going to do. I'm not going to worry about the filter or the sorting right now. We will come back to this in a few minutes. I'm going to click Build now. And the form itself is going to generate these queries. And what we typically recommend is that you copy these out to Notepad, because if you have many InfoPath forms open, you can't have a dialog open. You can't switch from one instance to the other. So we say, you know, just copy these out to Notepad so you have them somewhere. If you take a close look, queries number 2 and number 3 are the same. Are they exactly the same thing? So I don't need number 3. And query number 4 is actually used in code. If you were writing code, then you would need this. But we're not writing code in this lab, so we don't need to worry about that. So we go back to our form, and we go back to create the data connection because we got stuck. We didn't know what the query XML was, but now we know. So we're connecting to the QueryDB web service, and we'll let it find its operation screen. Once we get the operations, we can select get columns, XML string query. Like I said, this is what you will find in most of our documentation. The other ones are used infrequently. And we're back to our query XML parameter screen. But now we know what the query XML is. It's this. And why do we have to? We have to because the data connection wizard in InfoPath is going to ask us twice for these values. So we're going to have a sample value. This is our sample value. We just paste that in there. We click next. And then we have set value. And this is what we want. Why do we do that? Let me just make this larger and show you the difference. The difference is this right here. Why max rows 2? Because InfoPath needs at least 2 rows to derive an XML schema properly. So even if your table has 10,000 rows, just to get the sample data, just to get the schema derived correctly, we just need 2 rows. We don't need 10,000. So we're just limiting this for performance. And what does get sample mean? Get sample equals true means that if there are any blanks, we're just going to use some dummy data to fill in the gaps. And this becomes really valuable in SharePoint, because if you're querying a SharePoint list and there's a blank value in a column, I've seen the column not come through. The entire column just doesn't come through because the content is blank. So what we're saying is, get sample equals true means if you find a blank, just put some sample data in there. This is just while the data connection is being created, just so that the schema is derived properly. We're not actually going to be using this on load. So I'm going to call this query departments. And I'm going to return to my form load rules. And I'm going to add a rule called get departments. Why am I doing this? I never recommend setting QueryDB data connections to execute on load. I have seen them fail, especially in SharePoint 2010. So what I recommend is do not check the checkbox for automatically load, and instead query that data connection on load. So that's just a recommendation. You might, if you do it a different way and you don't get an error, then that's great. But this is just a recommendation. So here we're going to set a field's value. We're going to set the query XML. Remember that we just set a sample value in the data connection wizard. So now we don't want a sample value. Now we actually want the entire data set. So you don't see max rows here. And then we're going to query for that data, query departments. Okay, so there's my query departments data connection, and what that data connection is returning a count of the number of rows, and it's returning that department. It's only returning the department because that's the only column that we specified. So what can we do with this department? Well, we can hook it up with this field right here. And the way to do that is to turn that field into a drop-down. And the drop-down is going to give us an option to get our data from an external data. So we're going to get our data from query departments. And we don't have much to pick here because we only brought back one one row, one column called department. So that's all we have. So let's preview the form and take a look at this. So we have a department drop-down, and it has our 3 options from SQL. Okay. This is typically referred to as a static query, because no matter how many times you open the form, you're gonna get these department options, right? What's the benefit of setting this up? The benefit is, if I come to this SQL table and I add another row, that row, the next time that the form is open, the form is going to bring in that new row. So there's no change that needs to be done to the InfoPath form. So let me change this. So I'll add that, and let's say I add another row here, accounting accountant. So I just added those. I'm gonna come back to my form and preview my form once again to show that those options are gonna show up in the drop-down. There we go. So that's the simplest possible way of using QueryDB, but I want to show you the next step in the progression of difficulty, let's say, right? And that is, how do we get the position? How do we get the title? And the question here is, we don't want to show all of these. We don't want to show all of these positions, because if you selected administration for your department, you only need these 2 options for your position. If you selected sales for your department, you just need sales representative or sales manager for your position. So the title field is actually going to be a drop-down, but its contents are going to depend on the selection you made for department. So it's dynamic. So this next example, so the first example we did was static, because department list is static, right? But the title list is going to be dynamic. The title list is going to depend on what you select for department. So that's the next step here. We are going to return to Query Builder, and we are going to make some changes. The first thing we need to do is, for a dynamic connection, we need to attach the form template right here. This is the form template that we're currently designing. We're just going to attach it there. Nothing here changes. It's the same database, it's the same table, but we are querying not the department column. We are actually querying for the position. And then we want to filter. So we need to have some sort of comparison here. And the comparison is that the department is equal to a value from the form. So this node, this icon right here, select schema node, is going to bring up your form, and you can select the department node. So what you're basically saying is, go to the form, find the value of the department that was already selected, compare it to the department in the SQL table, and get me just the positions that match. This example is pretty simple, of course, but just imagine if you had 1,000 rows in this table, and you had 1,000 positions distributed among 50 departments. So that becomes pretty big, right? You're going to have your first drop-down department is going to have 50 options, and then your second department position is going to have just the positions that apply for that department. So as your data grows, this QueryDB becomes more powerful, because you're only going to be querying for the data that you need. So let's see, sorting. We can also sort the data. So let's just insert a sorting. Let's sort it by position, ascending, just so that it's alphabetical. And we'll click Build Now. So now, again, like we did last time, we're going to copy this out to Notepad. So we have our sample, we have our value, and we have this one. And you'll see immediately that this looks different from all the other ones. And the reason is, this is going to be used in the form rules. And the reason it has this concat formula, it's because it's going to be dynamic. Dynamic because if you look right here, this means that it's grabbing the value from the department node in your form. It's actually going to that XPath and grabbing the value. And that's why it's dynamic. So now that we have these queries ready, we can come back to data connections and add our data connection. Same web service. This is still QueryDB. We have to let it communicate here with the server. And as I said, this is what we use most of the time. Get columns, XML, string, query. And here we go. We start by filling out the sample value. So the sample value is our first one. The set value is our second one. And then we finish the data connection. Again, we're not letting this execute on load because we need the user to select a department first. Once the user selects a department, then we can go get the positions. So that means that we're not going to be adding any more to the form load rules. We're actually going to be adding them to the department dropdown itself. So we're going to say, let's have an action so that when a department dropdown gets selected, we're going to get the positions. So the first thing we need to do is we need to set the filter, and here's the query XML, right, that we set in rules. Remember that this is a function, right? So we click the FX button to enter that function, and we paste it in, and there it goes. That's our function. Query Builder built that for us, so we don't have to type it all out. And then we're going to query get positions. And then finally, just in the same way that we set up the department dropdown to get data from the query department data connection, we have to set up this dropdown to get its data from the right data source. Okay, so let's try that out. I don't need Notepad anymore because I finished here. So you see that there's no title. I have to select the department. So if I select sales, I have my sales manager, my sales representative. If I change my mind to administration, I have CEO, HR. So you see that the web service is very quick, right, to perform the filter. It takes less than a second and my filter is ready. So every time I check this, the form, every time I change the department dropdown, the form is going out to the server and executing the query and changing the value of the title field. So let's say I select support and support manager. So I have made the form a little bit easier for the user to fill out because I'm not asking them to type in a department or type in a title. They could type something in incorrectly. You could then be faced with some integrity issues, right? You're asking them to select a department and a title from a SQL database. Maybe that SQL database is controlled internally by your company. So there are no errors made here. Couple of final tips here. These are not in the lab in the training manual itself, but just some nice form design. One option here is to disable the title drop-down, so you can go to the new formatting option, and you can disable the title drop-down if the department is blank. So they have to select the department in order for the title drop-down to become enabled. And then the other thing you can do is when they change their mind about the department, so let's say action, clear position. So let's say, you know, they changed their minds, they changed the department. So let's actually empty out the contents of the title field. So let me show you what I mean, because that might be a little easier to illustrate. So see how the title dropdown is disabled? I can't do anything with it. So if I select a department, and then I select a title. So let's say that I change my mind, and I didn't mean to select accounting. So I change it to administration. It's going to clear the title field. So every time I change my mind about department, it's going to clear the title. So that's not necessarily a part of DBXL or, you know, the module, but it's just good InfoPath design, just to make your user's experience a little bit better.